premier président de l'ESMA depuis 2011 et vous êtes en cours de votre deuxième mandat. Auparavant, vous avez été le patron de l'AMF néerlandaise qui s'appelle l'AFM, qu'à titre personnel, je commence à fréquenter avec l'opération Gemalto. Donc une première étape en tant que responsable d'un régulateur. Et puis, vous avez eu, je crois, un début de carrière académique et universitaire. Voilà. Aujourd'hui, l'ESMA est évidemment au cœur de la réglementation pour beaucoup de sujets qui nous concernent, que ce soit le futur des MIR, le futur des taux d'intérêt, ou on l'a évoqué un peu plus tôt dans l'après-midi, la supervision des agences de rating, plein de sujets. Steven Maijoor va intervenir pour environ une vingtaine de minutes pour permettre du temps aux questions après, qu'on prendra comme d'habitude à travers l'appli ou en direct ici dans la salle. Steven Maijoor interviendra en anglais. Donc, Steven, I'll leave the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jean-Claude, for that very nice and friendly introduction. It is very good to be here at the conference of the association. And as you know, this is for me, this is the hometown. ESMA is located in Paris, so I'm able, and as you know, as was explained by Jean-Claude, I'm a Dutchman, so as you will understand, I will come here. I'm coming here on my bicycle. Although I must say I'm a bit frustrated by the bicycle program in Paris, that it hasn't been as successful since January this year, and I hope we will get very soon back to the quality that we had before January. Very good to have the opportunity to talk with you. Many of you, most of you, are treasurers. And Treasury is a key function in making the connection between the financing of activities and the capital market. And obviously the capital market is the core mandate. Supervising and regulating the capital market is the core mandate of ESMA. And we know that, and I know that treasurers play such an important role in making the connection between capital markets and the funding and financing of activities in the real market. Of course, some treasurers themselves are active in the financial sector, but there are many that are active in their core business in the non-financial sector, but still there's this very strong interconnection with the capital markets. As I just said, ESMA, for those of you who know us not that well, the supervision and regulation of capital markets is the core mandate of ESMA. It was explained by Jean-Claude as being the AMF of Europe. Indeed, the board of ESMA consists of the 28 national regulators, in addition to the chair, the 28 national regulators, and our core function is about regulating financial markets in the EU, making sure that these markets are supervised consistently across the EU, because you can have the same rules across the member states, but if they are supervised differently by the national regulators, you still don't have a true single market, no true internal market. And so the role of ESMA is to ensure consistency across the 28 national regulators when they conduct their supervision. In addition to that, we have a role regarding identifying risks in financial markets, and also in a number of cases, we directly supervise the capital markets participants, for example, regarding credit rating agencies. And I know that credit rating agencies is also a group of supervised entities that has the warm attention of treasurers. Other areas where ESMA is active is in the area of financial reporting, making sure that financial reports across the EU are supervised as consistently as possible, and also we have an important role in the area of prospectuses. So there are many interactions, I would say, between the treasury world and the world of financial markets and the world of supervision and regulation of financial markets. I know that many topics have been discussed here already today. What I would like to focus on is, first of all, the Capital Markets Union, developing capital markets in the EU. And secondly, I will focus on Brexit. And Brexit is currently getting more intensely debated probably than ever. I would expect that that even further increases in the days and the months ahead. Brexit is so important for us as a capital market supervisor, probably because capital markets is the area where there are the biggest interaction and the biggest connections between the UK and the EU 27. We know that the London financial market is a very important financial market in the EU. In some areas, it is the most important one, or maybe even in some areas, the single capital market. And so clearly, the fact that the UK will leave the EU will have a major implication for the EU financial markets, and therefore, this is very important on our agenda. But let me first start with the Capital Markets Union. And I know that this is, to some extent, a topic which has already been higher on the agenda for a longer time, but I think it's important to explain again why developing capital markets is so important for the EU. As you know, the EU has a financial system which is dominated by the banks, by the banking system, and you could argue that that is increasing the risks of instability in the financial system, or to say it in a more positive way, if we have a better balance between the capital markets and the banking system in the whole financial system, I think you can argue that the overall financial system would be safer. Of course, it also would increase the competitiveness of the financial system, because you would have multiple channels of funding available, and therefore we think it's very important to increase the role of the capital markets in the financial system. But there's not only an importance for, let's say, for the funding of companies, for the funding of activities. It is also very important for the other side of the capital market, where we have the households, where we have the retail savers, the retail investors. We know that they are more and more responsible for their own savings, to save for their educational expenses, to save for their own retirements later on. And if we give a bigger responsibility to households for their own savings for later, it is essential that they participate in the capital market. We all know from our textbooks that if you save through the banking system, is that ultimately you will get a lower return on your investment. And basically, in this stage, it is even very difficult to keep up with inflation. So it are these two elements. It's both from the side of the issuers, of companies, of the funding of activities, but also on the side of the households, that it's important that we get a bigger role of capital markets in the EU financial system. Obviously, trying to integrate and develop the European capital markets is already a program which is there for 40 years. The first attempts by the EU to try to build and integrate the European capital markets go back to about 40 years ago, when we started with, for example, the first common accounting directives in the EU. And if you look over those 40 years, we have made very good progress in terms of establishing a single rulebook for the EU capital markets. And many of you will be aware of all the not so attractive acronyms that we use in Europe to describe financial regulations, like the prospectus regulation, the AMIRs, the MiFIDs, the PRIPS. These all have contributed to a more consistent rulebook across the EU, and we're trying to reduce the barriers across the EU to make it easier for businesses to conduct their activities across the EU. At the same time, we have accelerated this integration of the EU capital markets recently, for example, with new regulations regarding securitizations, regarding prospectuses, and in addition to that, we think it's very important to ensure a high level of consumer protection when households are participating in the capital markets, for example, through MiFID and through PRIPS. What has been, on balance, the progress? Are the European capital markets now doing better than, let's say, 5 or 10 years ago? If you look at the statistics, indeed, there has been progress. To some extent, that might also be the result of the monetary policy and the financial crisis, where we know that banks had to reduce and to clean up their balance sheet, and some of them indeed have reduced the size of their balance sheet. That has resulted indeed in a more modest role of the banks in the EU, and also because of the low interest rate, we know that a large number of corporates have issued corporate debt and take the benefit of the low interest rates. At the same time, we're reaching the end of what we can achieve at this stage with the existing pieces of regulations. And one area, as you will understand, with my hat as a regulator, is where we need to progress further is in terms of consistent supervision. We now have a single rulebook, or we're very close to a very broad and detailed single rulebook. One of the biggest challenges, I think, in the years ahead is making sure that supervision is more and more consistent. ESMA plays a big role there, but we need better instruments to ensure consistency across the 28 member states. And in that sense, you will understand, I'm a big supporter of the proposals by the Commission to further strengthen the tools for the authorities, the European supervisory authorities, to achieve consistency across the member states. And I should say that the AMF here, very close by, actually, it's opposite the building, is one of the biggest supporters of increasing the powers for ESMA, and that is very much appreciated. Let me now, in the remainder of my contribution, focus on Brexit. And as I just said, Brexit is so important for the capital markets because probably within the financial system, it is the capital markets which are the most integrated between the UK and the EU 27. And so disentangling the UK and the EU 27 in this area is a major task for all involved. And I would like to mention 3 areas where ESMA, together with the national regulators, is active. The first issue is around relocations. So we can see now that UK market participants are relocating to the EU 27. The second area is about rethinking the way we interact with regulators outside the EU, and specifically, of course, with the UK once they have left the EU. And third is the preparations for the so-called no-deal risks. And let me briefly touch upon all 3 areas. So first, on relocation, we know that market participants are preparing for the risk of a no-deal, are trying to continue their access or ensuring their access to the EU 27. And so UK market participants are asking and asking the authorization in an EU 27 member state to ensure the continued access to the EU 27 market. That is in principle a positive response to the risks of the UK leaving the EU. What is important for us as regulators is to make sure that the regulatory and supervisory standards, when this activity is received across the various financial centers in the EU, that this is done in a consistent way. We cannot have a situation where financial centers are trying, in the EU 27, trying to attract this business from London, but allow, for example, on the basis of outsourcing and delegation, that nearly all of the activities continue to be in the UK, because that would result in so-called letterbox entities in the EU 27. That is the reason that together with the board, together with the national regulators, we have agreed to have a common standard around receiving this business for trading venues, for investment firms, for asset managers, and making sure that there is sufficient substance in the EU 27 when they get an authorization in the EU 27. The second issue that I just mentioned is thinking about the future new relationship with this very large financial market outside of the EU. And as you will understand, our rules and regulations were never designed with in mind having such a large financial center outside of the EU, but being next door. And that creates new issues that we need to be confronted with. Whatever happens as a result of Brexit, we can expect that the UK will continue to be an important financial market for the EU 27, and that raises the question, how do we want to cooperate with regulators in the UK? How do we want to interact with entities, with market participants outside the EU that are still very important for the EU? As you might be aware, we currently have a so-called equivalence system. Equivalence generally works well, but it's not a great system when there is a very large, for example, infrastructure outside the EU that is very influential for the EU or can impact on the risks in the EU. And we would, under an equivalence system, need to fully rely on the UK regulators. And that has been the reason that ESMA, that my board have argued, is that we need to have an improvement of the equivalence system, where if there are market infrastructures that are outside of the EU, which are so important for the EU 27, that can create risks for the EU 27, is that in addition to having equivalence, we have the powers and the possibilities to actively supervise those entities outside of the EU and not fully rely on the regulators outside the EU. The Commission has therefore proposed that ESMA would get bigger powers, these type of supervisory powers regarding CCPs. We know that the Parliament, in their discussions on the ESA review, also have argued that we should get certain powers regarding trading venues and CSDs. And this goes all back to this idea, in principle, equivalence is a good mechanism, but we need to improve it. And in those cases where there are certain risks for the EU 27 that need to be addressed and assessed from an EU 27 perspective, we should have the powers to do that. The final point I would like to make regarding Brexit is the preparations for a no-deal Brexit. And we all hope that there will be a withdrawal agreement. We can all read in the newspapers and make our own judgment of how close we are in terms of getting this agreement. But besides these developments, we still need to prepare for the risks of a no deal. Obviously, it would be in the interests of the UK 27 and the UK to get an agreement, but we cannot rule out that the UK will leave by the end of March without any agreement in place and becomes right away, straight away, in our speak, in our terms, a so-called third country. And that would mean that they would lose their authorizations and that the passporting system would not work anymore for UK market participants. ESMA, in line with the European Commission and with the other EU institutions, we have generally taken the line that the market participants should prepare for these risks and that there is in principle the responsibility is for the private sector to prepare for those risks. What ESMA has done is do a very careful analysis where might there be risk where the private sector cannot prepare. And we have identified one area where we think that that is not possible, and that relates to central clearing and the access to UK CCPs, where it is important, according to the board of ESMA, to ensure continued access to the UK CCPs in the case of no deal. We were therefore very happy with the communication by the Commission, by Vice President Dombrovskis, to say that indeed that under strict conditions and also time limited, there should be equivalence in the case of a no deal. Further information on this was expressed today by the Commission. In addition to that, ESMA has made a proposal where we can make it easier to repaper the non-centrally cleared derivatives. If there's any question on that, I can go into that. But we have just proposed last week a change in a technical standard that will make it easier to repaper when one of the two counterparties to a non-centrally cleared derivative is a UK counterparty. Let me stop here. Let me emphasize maybe one more point on why the development of the Capital Markets Union and consistency and supervision is so important. What we're seeing now, and what I already expressed, is that financial market activity is relocating to some extent from the UK to the EU 27. But the new model in the EU 27 will not be a model where it's concentrated in one city. You can see that it's going over various cities. You can see business going, of course, to Paris. Some business is going to Frankfurt. Some of it is going to Dublin. It's going to Luxembourg. It's going to Amsterdam. And so instead of having it concentrated in one city and in one regulator, it is now going to different regulators. And so consistency and supervision there is essential. And in addition to that, of course, it is important that we continue to develop the capital market, because whatever happens as a result of Brexit, there will be more barriers between the EU 27 and the UK. Thank you very much for your attention. Is there any question that you would like to raise, or is the competition with the drinks and the canapés too strong? Jean-Marc, you need a microphone, I suppose. There's one question. I can hear you.
Thank you. So sustainable finance is pretty high on the Commission's agenda, and there's currently an effort to find the right taxonomy, find labeling for sustainable bonds. Do you see ESMA in the future taking a role in supervising agencies that would put labels on bonds or financial products, like, because you supervise credit rated agencies?
So first, and as Jean-Marc very well pointed out, we clearly have increased our efforts in the area of sustainability. I should say here is that the private sector to some extent has been leading this area and has been much more advanced than the public sector, and I think now it's advancing more and more in the private sector, and there is a demand for, let's say, credible measures of sustainability and also credible audit or insurance on, for example, what are green bonds, how do you measure that, how do you make sure that it's not only about measurement but also about assurance, that also the public sector comes in terms of various measures in the area of sustainability. I think the question that you're asking is a question really about the future. So what you can see now is that the developments in the public sector are much more now about taxonomy. It is about making more meaningful disclosures. Also, ESMA will have a role, for example, on the methodologies for those benchmarks that call themselves to be sustainable benchmarks. And so there, the role of ESMA is already in the direction of, let's say, measurement and making sure that there's more reliable information on investments that are labeled as being green. In the area of credit rating agencies, our first step now is first to assess whether, when a rating is given, that ESG factors are taken into account and how it affects their, let's say, their credit worthiness. So it's, and to some extent, it's still the traditional role of ratings. And at this stage, I should probably not prejudge our role in the future, but clearly, somewhere in the future, we need to move on a track of more credible measurement of, ESG factors, but also the attestation of these ESG factors. And you would need, at one point in time, entities and rating agencies that would do it. How that will develop, I think it's too early to answer that question. But I would not rule it out somewhere in the faraway future. One more question. Okay, thank you very much for your attention.